Hello and welcome to Perfecting the Prequels, The Phantom Menace. Several months ago, I appeared on Nathan Hood's channel to discuss with him the idea of fixing the prequel trilogies. We were able to devise about 3 plot summaries, one for each of the Star Wars prequel films, and I thought based on that idea, it would be rather interesting to actually develop some of the devices, some of the changes that we brought up in that stream, and translate it from a broad stroke summary by being able to flesh out some of the more pertinent details. If you want to watch that video, I've included a link in the description. But first, I would like to start off by doing a concise summary of the points we came up with in that stream. The rules were for fixing, or rather redrafting, the prequels were to keep as close to the characters and spirit of Lucas's original vision, with the central focus on the fall of the Jedi, the fall of the Republic, and the fall of Anakin Skywalker. And this is something I really want to emphasize in case it came across in that previous video as if I was bashing the prequels too much or I was attacking George Lucas. I want to emphasize that from a world building point of view and in terms of big ideas, I think the prequels have so much going for them. Indeed, I think George Lucas's original vision is in some sense far more ambitious than that of the original trilogy. And compared to the story and the world building in the sequel trilogy, there is no comparison whatsoever. So I really want to emphasize that I do actually have quite a strong respect for George Lucas. However, it is clear that he has severe limitations when it comes to his ability to translate those ideas, when it comes to his ability to write, and in terms of the more specific aspects of writing, such as his ability to create believable dialogue. And I think, again, this is a symptom of something else that was brought up in that stream with Nathan Hood, which is Lucas's biggest weakness as a storyteller seems to be in character development specifically. And a lot of the redrafting process was focused on fleshing out those characters, developing those characters, and making their actions make sense, and making all of those actions consistent with what was previously established. I don't want to imply that I'm of the red letter media or the George Lucas raped my childhood variety of Star Wars fan, because I really believe that sort of you could even say sort of cancerous criticism has perhaps left us in the state where Disney Star Wars was inspired to go along with their sequel trilogy without any world building, so to speak, with only a superficial sort of nod to the style of the original trilogy. No, this is a project I'm invested in because I do believe that there is a wonderful set of films which are hidden essentially behind a puzzle piece which is just a puzzle which is just all misarranged. And the process here with this idea of perfecting the prequels based upon the previous stream redrafting the prequels is simply about rearranging all of the pieces in order to see Lucas's original vision perhaps come to full fruition. Had, say, for example, he had more script doctors, or had he been willing to defer certain aspects of the storytelling, perhaps even given up a ultimate sort of process of writing and maybe as director in order to assume a more sort of you can say almost keeper of the flame, so to speak, regarding the development of these films. So all of the changes, as with reference to that original stream, are going to keep the same characters, going to keep the same plot points, the same sort of alien creatures and those devices, but rearrange them. And controversially, I'm not getting rid of Jar Jar in this draft either, but I will be completely changing his character beyond all recognition. Of course, referring to that point which George Lucas brought up in behind the scenes making of footage that Jar Jar is the key to this to get Jar Jar working, because he's a funnier character than we've had in all the previous films. He's not going to be a funny character in my draft, but if Lucas is so desperate to have Jar Jar in the story, I'm going to try and find a way in which Jar Jar actually makes sense. So going forward with this, George Lucas is very much inspired by a certain sort of conception of history. Indeed, what I brought up in that previous stream is that I believe that the Phantom Menace is very much a historical reference to the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. And this is borne out by not just the plot, the basic plot of a powerful empire invading a weakly defended planet with effectively no resistance, going off to appeal to the League of Nations for help, and then of course being rebuffed and we're going to send a planetary sort of investigative team to see if the claims of the invasion are valid. All of this, of course, is recounting the aspects of the invasion of Manchuria, but going beyond that, George Lucas actually wedded various aspects of the aesthetic of the prequel trilogy to, I would say, bolster that historical reference, which is why Amidala looks like a Manchurian Chinese princess. The Nemoidians have Japanese accents. In many ways, I would actually say that this acts as a detriment, because it seems that the historical reference is too on the nose, but maybe the historical analogy is too obscure to lay people watching this, that many people have never brought this up. But nevertheless, I think Lucas is very much versed in history, and he very much wants to tease out these various parallels. So I'm going to be keeping to the spirit of that. In terms of the point by point assessment of the original prequel trilogy, I'm not going to be rehashing those points. I assume if you're watching this live stream, you have a awareness of those films, you have watched those films. So I will be going ahead with summarizing the changes. Darth Plagueis, the Master of Palpatine, is the unambiguous antagonist of the redrafted Phantom Menace, though Palpatine is clearly the Phantom Menace. However, Ian McDiarmid is never referenced as Darth Sidious, and he never appears hooded as he does in hologram iterations of his character. And I just want to make a note on the original inspiration for the hood, which is that when George Lucas was creating the Emperor character in The Empire Strikes Back, which wasn't actually originally played by Ian McDiarmid, the inspiration from the hood actually came from the Roman Empire. The Roman emperors, obviously the emperor of the Roman emperors. It came from the Pontifex Maximus, who was the spiritual leader of the Roman Republic, who would often, in his capacity of the high priest, you can almost say Sith Lord of the Roman Empire, would wear a white hood. And of course, Lucas took that inspiration and changed it from a white hood to a black hood. So in the context of him being emperor, and indeed in the context of Revenge of the Sith, him wearing a hood is actually quite a neat historical analogy. But from the point of view of the films starting off with Darth Sidious as Senator Palpatine, it actually makes no sense whatsoever. So if anything, this is a point where perhaps Lucas didn't understand the original sort of conception behind Palpatine's regalia in Return of the Jedi. But nevertheless, all of this is to say that Ian McDiarmid is simply Palpatine throughout the first and second films in this redraft, and he is never shown as wearing the hood until he comes out as full Darth Sidious in Revenge of the Sith. Padme Amidala becomes queen at the beginning of the film, and this is following the suspicious death of her father, which has caused uncertainty and major civil strife. In this redraft, she is the hereditary queen, with no bizarre reference to term limits or children becoming queens as stated in the Clone Wars. And the issue with this, again, I'm going to be adding a little bit of context more so than what was brought up in that stream with Nathan. And again, this is very much a collaborative effort. These ideas which I'm espousing are very much ideas which were formed in the spirit of collaboration between myself and Nathan. So please check out their original stream. But just to add a bit of context on this, the characterization of Padme Amidala in Phantom Menace is essentially a self-contained characterization for the film. She is essentially Queen Elizabeth II, a royal archetype. Whereas in this redraft, essentially, she is overwhelmed by the immense responsibility of having power foisted on her prematurely thanks to the death of her father, because having her as a QE2 archetype effectively means or meant that George Lucas had to create a new character in the Clone Wars, Senator Amidala, as opposed to Queen Amidala. And this in many ways is the parallel to Jake Lloyd's Anakin versus Hayden Christensen's Anakin. Thereby, the characterizations in The Phantom Menace for both these characters are self-contained, but the desire here is to make these characters consistent throughout all three films. And you can actually say that this isn't a point which is often brought up enough, is that it's not just Jake Lloyd as Anakin, but also Queen Amidala as Anakin do not make sense in the round in terms of being able to extract consistent character traits throughout all three films. So that is the establishment of Padme's character, that she is a young queen who is obviously a hereditary queen, not an elected queen, who has this responsibility foisted upon her prematurely thanks to the suspicious death of her father. Now here, the Trade Federation are just the Nemoidians, or you can say, come up with a more sort of dramatic turn of phrase like the Dominion of Nemoidia, because the Trade Federation evokes, you can say, anachronistic associations which are spurred on by what exactly is a trade federation in the context of enacting a blockade and then a planetary invasion. The original Phantom Menace brings this up in the sense that Palpatine talks about the invasion or the tragedy that happened in the Senate with the taxation of trade routes. But again, that in a sense is never built upon, and it's not really satisfying as a plot device in terms of being able to create, you can say, genuine stakes for the planetary invasion, because all of these terms are nebulous, and we don't understand what any of these things mean, and indeed they're dropped and never brought up again. And as with Jake Lloyd as Anakin, and as the Queen Elizabeth Manchurian Queen Padme, you can almost say that the Nemoidians in Attack of the Clones and even Newt Gunray are basically different characters as well. All of these aspects are reset, which again you can say is a failing of the original film to bring all of these ideas forward in a satisfying way. So in order to make this clear, just the Nemoidians, just this dominion of Nemoidia. And you can actually say that the focus on Trade Federation actually detracts from Lucas's, you can say, original historical analogy, his Manchurian analogy, because in this redraft, the motivation of the Nemoidians is much closer to that of the original Japanese, which is expansionism, colonization, and would be resource acquisition as a militant state, and indeed a pariah state as Japan was becoming in the 1930s. And in this situation, the scenario, Naboo has resources that the Nemoidians need to sustain the expansion of their massive droid armies. Very similar to what we saw with Japan and the build-up of the Imperial Japanese Navy and expanding into China. Here, Plagueis, the antagonist of the film, is allied to the Nemoidians with his aim of committing a dramatic atrocity against the Jedi should they decide to respond to the invasion. Now, the fundamental aspect of the Phantom Menace is that there are two conceptions of what it means to be a Sith: political subversion, intrigue, clandestine sort of covert operations, as with Palpatine, or the quintessential sort of brute warlord, as with Darth Plagueis. And effectively, there is a shadow war between apprentice and master, the dual aspects of the Phantom Menace. as with Palpatine's rise to power in the Republic, i.e., Palpatine is the Phantom Menace to Plagueis, and he is the Phantom Menace of the Republic. There is a double meaning here, again, to reinforce Lucas's original vision. Obi-Wan is made the clear, undisputed protagonist of the film, where, again, Mr. Plinkett sort of brings up this idea that there isn't a clear protagonist. And I hate to bring this point up again, but Obi-Wan's character also seems self-contained, and he appears like a different character in Attack of the Clones. So again, trying to untangle this and create consistent characters throughout all three films. Obi-Wan's character is consistent throughout all three films. He is much closer to how he appeared in Clone Wars, plucky, witty, impetuous, all of these things, and he is introduced as a inexperienced Jedi on his first ever Jedi mission, as representing the Republic at the ascent of the young Queen Amidala, alongside Qui-Gon Jinn, his Jedi Master. The Jedi are there to offer to protect Queen Amidala when the Sith and the Neimoidians attack, and they offer to bring her back to Coruscant, but she rejects this offer, declaring that she will stand with her people, compared to what happened in the original film where she comes with them and escapes the planet. And this really enables us, going back to Padme, to witness the damage done to the people of Naboo and establish clear motivations for the Jedi to come and rescue her. And indeed, this is a clear parallel to what happened to Princess Leia in A New Hope. It's like poetry, it rhymes. In this draft, the Jedi escape, but are pursued by a Sith Neimoidian cruiser. The situation with Maul was ambiguous in this redraft, with Nathan favouring Maul in a more prominent role vis-a-vis Plagueis. Indeed, Nathan's idea is that Maul would be the more prominent antagonist rather than Plagueis appearing. But we both agreed that Maul would be leading this attack and would be responsible for damaging the ship and causing it to crash land on Tatooine. Tatooine in itself is a symptom of corruption and a testament to the Republic's failure. The pod race is recontextualized as this epic hippodrome in Constantinople-esque affair, a nexus for gambling, and our introduction to a 16-year-old slave, Anakin Skywalker, in which he competes successfully in these pod races and makes vast sums of money for his Hutt masters through gambling. Both he and his mother Shmi have a far worse life than is depicted in the original film, with Shmi accustomed to hard labor, as was the case for Anakin himself before the Hutts found a more profitable use for him. The Jedi are introduced to him personally by the Hutts as the only mechanic capable of fixing their crashed ship, from which the Jedi deduce that he is an incredibly powerful Force user, though the aspects relating to his conception through the Force and Shmi are removed from this draft because we both found that it made Palpatine omniscient, omnipotent, far too powerful in a way that denied other characters agency. However, this series of events is far less contrived, because the pod race essentially is the central hub of Tatooine, and it's only natural that the Jedi visit there in order to hunt out any sort of client who can help them fix their ship. And they're able to see Anakin himself competing in this race, and are further introduced to him when the Hutts suggest that he is their master mechanic. The Hutts allow Anakin to fix the ship. However, this is in return for political favors, and the Hutts here are banking on the unimpeachable reputation of the Jedi as guardians of peace and justice and as diplomatic representatives. However, Obi-Wan wants to release Anakin from slavery. The Hutts won't surrender him under any circumstances, as he's far too valuable, both as a mechanic and a source of gambling revenue. The issue of Anakin's slavery creates divisions between Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon Jinn, with the latter now not wanting to create a diplomatic incident between the Republic and Tatooine. And in order to add a bit of context, you can say, with the Hutts suspecting that the Jedi will betray them, they attack the ship, and Anakin reluctantly abandons his mother to escape with the Jedi. And the effect of this is that the Jedi have de facto declared war on the Hutts and Tatooine. The redraft then focuses significantly on the internal philosophy and politics of the Jedi, among many things on the consequences of action versus inaction in the face of danger. Having returned to Coruscant with Anakin, we are introduced to Jedi factions. The conservative faction is led by Ki-Adi-Mundi. Dooku is featured prominently here, not essentially introduced in the second film, Clone Wars, and here he leads the interventionist faction, and Yoda acts as a mediator between the two extremes. Now, this is important. We're not inventing, Nathan and I, any new characters. Instead, what we're doing is we're taking characters without much development in the original films, and we're either fleshing them out or repurposing them in order for them to have a far more effect on the events of the plot. And here, actually, Ki-Adi-Mundi, who I think it's fair to say, with the exception of Mace Windu, is one of the most prominent members of the Jedi Council. Ki-Adi-Mundi is repurposed and essentially becomes actually one of the main characters, and you can say a secondary antagonist throughout these films. Now we come to the issue of Anakin. Anakin desires, obviously, to return to Tatooine to rescue his mother, and he is introduced to the Jedi Council. The Jedi Council here are all agreed that he should be trained, though each faction has radically different interpretations of what training Anakin would look like. The conservative faction wishes for him to undergo a process of extreme self-denial and suppression of the will to make him passive, a point which was really compounded by the Jedi's fear of Plagueis and the return of the Sith. The idea that if he doesn't go through this process of self-denial, that he may be tempted to go off and join Plagueis. The interventionist faction want to train Anakin in combat as a sword against the Sith. You can say the quintessential sort of Lord of the Rings argument: do we use the ring or do we destroy it? Thematically, the through line for Anakin's character is slavery and his aspirations for emancipation. The Jedi do not present freedom for Anakin, but rather a different form of slavery than that of the Hutts. The only solace for Anakin is that, per what he has learned about Amidala in their travels, perhaps even seeing an image of her, kind of like "Help me, Obi-Wan, you're my only hope," as with Princess Leia, the aspect of saving Amidala is something he's allowed to resolve. It's something that entices him. And so he is drawn to the Naboo situation as in many ways an ability to break out from this, you can almost say, nascent incarceration which the Jedi are going to put him through. It's something he may be able to become a part of. Now, coming back to what's happening on the Senate, Palpatine as senator exploits the Naboo sympathy vote against Valorum, however, in this draft to a much greater extent. Here he is able to demonstrate how Naboo's defense was entirely predicated on its relationship to the Republic, and inaction towards Naboo from the Republic would be the greatest betrayal of Naboo and a challenge to the legitimacy of the Republic. And as a result of this, Palpatine is elected and spurs the Jedi on to action in the absence of any other Republican force. Palpatine effectively splits the Jedi over this issue, with a rogue element of the interventionist faction defying the Council to deal with the Naboo situation. Dooku supports the faction, but is unwilling to create a definite and unprecedented schism in the Council leadership, Dooku, of course, being one of the three most prominent Council members, and indeed create a schism in the Jedi as a whole by rejecting that of his two other sort of co-leaders, Yoda and Ki-Adi-Mundi. You can almost see this as a Jedi triumvirate. And so he remains, but aspects of interventionist Jedi will go over to Naboo to fight Plagueis, while he himself remain in Coruscant, with major implications going forward in terms of the redraft of the Clone Wars. As an act of great sympathy, Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon Jinn convince Yoda, in particular, to bring Anakin over to Naboo against the Council's desire, lest it compound Anakin's own feelings of imprisonment, resentment, believing that this would be counterproductive if you want to suppress all aspects of anger and fear within Anakin. Anakin and Obi-Wan are very close in age, They're essentially brotherly characters, and the emphasis in this redraft is far more on their relationship rather than that established in the film between Jake Lloyd and Qui-Gon Jinn as a father-son relationship. When in Tatooine, um, when in Naboo, the Jedi, perhaps coupled with a few other Jedi, confront Plagueis, who stands in between them and rescuing Padme Amidala. This confrontation occurs alongside a combined effort by all the forces of the Naboo, including the Gungans, to expel the Nemoidian droid army from Naboo. And this will be a single comprehensive action combining the three separate actions of the original film: the attack on the blockade ship, the capture of the Viceroy, and the Gungan diversion. Here, the Gungans and the Naboo militia together defeat the droids, mainly through the surprise of these two seemingly hostile factions joining forces against the droids, and they ensure the capture of Nute Gunray and the retreat of the blockade ships from Naboo, in return essentially for ransoming back to the Nemoidian Dominion. Here, Pelagius is easily able to dispatch some of the Jedi accompanying Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon Jinn, and you can perhaps see this as representative of a parallel to what we saw in Revenge of the Sith, when 4 Jedi, including Mace Windu, confront him, Palpatine, in his office, and Palpatine is easily able to kill 3 of them, only leaving Mace. However, Qui-Gon is only able to defeat Pelagius by sacrificing himself with a device that kills both him and Pelagius. This is essentially, for Qui-Gon Jinn has been displayed as demonstrating extreme caution, and this is a great juxtaposition throughout the rest, in comparison to the rest of the film, in contrast to Obi-Wan, where Qui-Gon Jinn makes the most reckless and selfless sacrifice, in contrast to his previous sort of demonstration of caution, in order, you can say, for that character's arc to be completed, and you can say to compound the aspect of his martyrdom, and indeed the responsibility that Obi-Wan has now for the training of the young Anakin. Obi-Wan is left with that responsibility, and they are finally able to rescue Padme. So that is, in brief summary, what Nathan and I agreed to in our Fixing the Prequels stream. Now, here are some revisions, or you can say embellishments, based on those original ideas. So, having suggested that Palpatine was responsible for, that the previous king of Naboo had died under suspicious circumstances. Here, this isn't again referenced in the film, but in terms of understanding this from a writer's point of view, not necessarily in terms of being able to actually declare this to the audience. This is only something we would find out in the third film. Palpatine murdered the King of Naboo, and that is the one act which precipitates all of the events of the film. Indeed, Palpatine, you can say, is almost like a Claudius character in Hamlet. He's a wicked advisor, dropping sort of ear poison into the king, declaring, no, the Republic will save us, the Republic will protect us, we don't need to invest in our own defenses. All the while, he is working covertly with his master Pelagius and the Nemoidians in order to facilitate a planetary invasion. He betrays Naboo despite being its senator, and commits the final act of treason, which is to murder the king, to bring in Padme Amidala into power, and thus fracture Naboo society on the eve of the invasion. And of course, Palpatine is aiding in Pelagius's intention to commit a massive atrocity against the Jedi, or break the reputation of the Jedi as defenders of justice should they do nothing. So in the original draft, the aspect was Pelagius committing a mass atrocity, but this is simply to emphasize that Pelagius wins either way. Either he is able to kill Jedi, or he is able to essentially delegitimate the Jedi, if they are simply proponents of an action in the situation, and they allow Naboo to be destroyed. In terms of just mentioning the aesthetics, I'm a big fan of the Naboo aesthetic. I remember as a child as one of my favorite things, and indeed, it sort of contrasts this sort of peaceful idyll which is turned upside down by the prospect of a planetary invasion. That I will mention in this image, which I think is from Attack of the Clones. The Plaza de España in Seville is used far too much in films. In fact, this building was also used as Cairo in Lawrence of Arabia, if you notice. But anyway, this idea of perfecting the prequels is actually going to focus a tad in terms of aesthetics. Of course, the other sort of great building which informs the aesthetic of Naboo is that of the royal palace outside Naples, which I believe is the interior shots for the Palace of Naboo scenes. So I don't really have anything wrong with that in terms of being able to establish Naboo essentially in that sort of idyllic, peaceful perspective in order to really compound the idea that if this planet in particular were lost, it would represent a enormous calamity for the rest of the Republic, given that although Naboo is defenseless, Naboo is definitely one of the richest planets. And this actually feeds into another idea, which I'm going to bring up, building upon the idea of resource extraction that was developed in the original redraft. Now, in terms of Maul's specific character, because that was ambiguous in the original redraft, Maul is a bodyguard to Newt Gunray. Newt Gunray here is not the, you can say, ambiguous title of Viceroy. Newt Gunray is the sovereign of Nemoidia, and he is the Viceroy of Naboo. He is only the Viceroy of Naboo because he has taken over power on behalf of Padme Amidala, hence the title of Viceroy makes sense. I know I'm actually being a bit pedantic here, but having some sort of inclination towards royalist history, I like all of this to be clear, as with the title of Trade Federation, getting rid of Trade Federation, for the sake of causing needless confusion. Because, you know, even if Lucas wanted a title which wasn't just like the boss, the lord, or the king, Viceroy creates a lot of ambiguity as to what is he Viceroy over, essentially. So, Sovereign of Nemoidia, Viceroy of Naboo. Indeed, Maul is interesting in that he is not aligned originally to Pelagius, and he is the only instance of the Nemoidians not utilizing droids. Indeed, he is also a general of the Nemoidians and will be the face of, you can say, the militant side of the Nemoidians and the dark side to the Jedi when they conceive of their original attack on Naboo. And this is a brilliant way, really, of developing not just Maul's character, but Pelagius's character, because it is through the influence of Pelagius that Maul has actually been drawn over originally to the power of the dark side, though he is never officially a Sith as a representative of Nemoidia and later of the Confederation of Independent Systems. This clearly establishes him as a secondary antagonist across the three films. Now, just a point of aesthetics. On the left here, you can see Newt Gunray, and this character isn't mentioned on the left, but I believe he was the commander of the droid blockade, as we saw later on in the film when Jake Lloyd, in a rather infamous scene, ends up basically destroying the main blockade ship and causing all the droid ships to break down. One of the major failings of Lucas's vision of the antagonists is that the droids are useless. This is something Lucas sort of admitted to. You can just cut them down like butter, and droids are really useless. Indeed, this character on the left is incredibly cowardly. When the Jedi basically announce themselves, when the protocol droid basically announces that they aren't just diplomats, they are warriors, this Nemoidian on the left says, the blockade is finished, we can't do anything against the Jedi. And to this, Sidious quite rightly says, remove this scum from my sight. You can't establish a series of formidable antagonists and make them pathetic and cowardly off the back. If you're going to really heighten the intimidation factor from the antagonists, perhaps get rid of all of the battle line droids and replace them with something actually intimidating like the droidicas. And as for the actual design of the Nemoidians, I don't really think they are that bad necessarily, but I'm sure you can perhaps wither their features and change them or sort of transition them enough to the point that they are incredibly dark, menacing creatures, in the same way that George Lucas was able to create that with Darth Maul. Of course, they aren't a militant people, but they are a very sort of politically savvy and ambitious people, and that should also be represented in their aesthetic. And this also comes to the way they are able to speak. They shouldn't have very clear Japanese accents, even though the allusion is very clear to the historical Japanese and their invasion of Manchuria. Instead, you can say they should have more gruff, intimidating, alien voices, whatever that should be. Just a note on how these characters should be presenting themselves. And any hint of sort of patheticness or cowardness, like we see on the left here, should not only be demonstrated to the audience, but demonstrated so early as we saw in the film. So again, this is a major failing in terms of being able to sell these as major antagonists, because compare this with A New Hope, for example. Vader, the stormtroopers, and the Death Stars are incredibly intimidating. And I believe George Lucas was trying to recreate an aspect of that aesthetic with the blockade ships, the Neimoidian blockade ships. But then you bring in these characters, and you can say the intimidation factor is brought down, and you instead have to rely on Darth Sidious in order to cultivate that fear among the audience, essentially. Why is it impossible to take someone like a Darth Plagueis, who would essentially be the aspect here, and the Neimoidians, and making both antagonist factions intimidating? I don't believe it's impossible at all. And again, just little tweaks in order to actually make the stakes sort of invest the audience in the stakes for the rest of the film. So going back to the situation on Naboo, focusing on the murder of the King of Naboo, we have the funeral, and after the funeral, Padme Amidala is subject to her first Privy Council meeting, with Palpatine essentially as the preeminent figure in this meeting. And here, as with the, you can say, original conception of his relationship to the first king of Naboo, Palpatine reiterates Naboo's general indebtedness to the Republic and calmly observed that the Neimoidians wouldn't dare attack Naboo. And you can say that this could be made into a very dramatic scene compared to what we actually see in the film, which is perhaps the sun is coming down, all the advisors are sort of nervous, they sort of fear an impending sort of planetary invasion, what the Neimoidians are doing, they're coming in, they're drawing in, and Palpatine is standing there defiant, trying to be the voice, you can say, of calm pragmatism, reason here, by declaring that Naboo has nothing to fear. And as he's saying this, as he's sort of emphasizing the power of the Republic, communications are cut all across the planet, the sun goes down, and transmissions are felt, and recordings of ships coming in. Sentries essentially are alerted, and the invasion begins. The Jedi, as in the original draft, had been there to represent the Republic at the funeral of the king and the ascent of the new queen. And as they're about to leave, they're not in this Privy Council meeting. Just before then, I again just want to point to aesthetics. As you can see with Amidala's look here, I'm not sure if the film actually suffers from this, but you can almost say that the aesthetic here is entirely sort of ripped off from 19th century Qing era princesses and empresses. You know, she looks very much like the Empress Dowager Cixi, which, again, the historical analogy is very much on the nose for me. But maybe have a tiny bit more creativity in terms of being able to take the historical inspiration and perhaps transform it a little bit more. Because in some way, the aesthetics of the prequels are original, but in some sense, they're incredibly derivative, as with this. And also, Natalie Portman here is playing the character all wrong, although she is directed to do so, which is defiant, unswerving, the royal archetype, you know, stiff upper lip and all that, when really she shouldn't be. She should be quizzical, she should be afraid, and she should be looking to someone like Palpatine, the principal advisor of her father, for essentially confidence and advice, and she will get neither. And indeed, her relationship with Palpatine is something which is going to be a consistent feature throughout all of these films. But emphasis here, which wasn't in the original draft, Palpatine is on Naboo when the invasion happens. He is not in Coruscant. He is not communicating through them by a hologram. He is actually on the planet. And of course, why is he on the planet? He is on the planet because he has just been responsible for murdering the previous king. And indeed, you can say the original plan between Plagueis and Palpatine as Sith master and Sith apprentice is that Palpatine has essentially facilitated the invasion, and then he will announce himself as a Sith and join Plagueis in their attempt essentially to massacre Jedi and ruin the Republic. But this essentially is where things begin to change. The Jedi who are about to leave are among the first to witness the invasion force and rush back to the palace. The Jedi successfully reach Padme and Senator Palpatine, and it is here that Padme, a terrified Padme, takes a very sort of heroic stand and insists on staying. But Palpatine agrees essentially that he must come back with the Jedi in order to warn the Senate about the invasion and be that representative for the Queen. Essentially, Padme is investing a lot in the Jedi and Palpatine in terms of being able to ameliorate the situation, while she herself will suffer alongside her people. And indeed, this is not part of the plan. This wasn't the plan with Plagueis. And essentially, this is the indication that Palpatine has gone rogue, and this is the beginning, you can say, of Palpatine being the Phantom Menace to Plagueis and showing his own independent agency. And this is something I really want to emphasize in my rework of that original draft, which is that Palpatine actually features very little in the original Phantom Menace or Attack of the Clones. Rather, he only really has a large appearance in the third film. And indeed, you can say that is what elevates Revenge of the Sith, and what people remember about it are the appearances by Ian McDiarmid. And so I believe the previous two films suffer from a lack of Palpatine. And given how central a character he is, he shouldn't be reduced to about 5 minutes of scenes. And indeed, you can say in these redrafts, because there is no hologram, because there is no hooded Sidious, we only see the Senator Palpatine. It is more imperative to see more of Palpatine. And I think it's actually quite effective in terms of him being able to develop his character, that he is there at the beginning. He is there alongside the Queen, and he travels with the Jedi back to Coruscant. However, now there is an issue in terms of being able to develop this plot, which is that all the Naboo ships have been commandeered or scuttled, and the party are essentially grounded until my very controversial rewrite, but again, I'm trying to give George Lucas as much of the benefit of the doubt as I can, they meet Jar Jar Binks. However, Jar Jar Binks is essentially a tragic character in this. He's not a comedic character, he's not funnier than any other character we've had before, but rather he is as we saw in the film, he is an exiled Gungan from the underwater city, and that is because he was raised by human parents. So he basically represents that odd conduit between Naboo and Gungan society, and as a result, he's been ostracized from both of them. Yes, you can say this is a very sort of cliche commentary when it comes to I don't know, sort of mixed race, sort of fractured heritage. But nevertheless, I'm not investing any of my own ideas onto this script in terms of broader themes. I'm very much wanting to tease out what George Lucas's original vision is here. And so there you can actually say Jar Jar, rather than just being a terrible comedic character, now actually has a backstory and an investment in what's going on. Because it is Jar Jar who is aware of the Gungan city, where all of the Naboo citizens basically shun the Gungans. He brings the Jedi and Palpatine over to the Gungan city and meet Boss Nass, who very coldly, as we saw in the film, meets Jar Jar. However, he is reluctantly convinced by the Jedi and Palpatine to lend the party a ship. And that is the ship they use to fly to Coruscant, the Gungan ship. Not, of course, they have water ships, but this you can say is one of their few spacefaring ships. Essentially, they're not just all a waterborne species. They are actually capable of traveling by warp speed, etc. But of course, their ships are not near to the quality of the actual sort of Naboo ships or the Naboo warships, and they are not the quality of the Nemoidian ships either. So this is a compared to the glamorous silver royal yacht ship that we saw in the Phantom Menace. This is, you can say, almost like a a aqua sort of I don't know, stingray-esque version of the Millennium Falcon or something, like an emergency sort of transport ship or whatever. So that is the ship that Boss Nass gives them, which Palpatine, along with the Jedi, fly on. However, this ship is quite easily intercepted, regardless of the Jedi's piloting ability, and it is shot down by Maul's Neimoidian flagship, and as a result, they are stranded on Tatooine, as in the original film. Now, of course, remembering what the original backstory is in this new version, Anakin is a 16-year-old pod racer slave, and the Hutts allow Anakin to fix their ship. The addition here is that because Palpatine is here, Palpatine suggests that Anakin be brought back to Coruscant, and this is for political reasons. He has visited Tatooine. He has just come from the planetary invasion in Naboo, and he's thinking, well, Tatooine is, as previously elucidated, Tatooine is another example of the failure of the Republic and the rampant corruption of the Republic, and indeed lawlessness within the Republic. And Anakin could be a useful banner case, essentially, to elicit more sympathy in his attempts ultimately to remove Chancellor Valorum. Indeed, that was Palpatine's original plan, something Plagueis was not aware of, because Plagueis believed that Palpatine would join him in the invasion, conquest, and occupation of Naboo. But of course, this is Palpatine's hidden agenda, which is to go back to the Senate and oust Valorum and become Supreme Chancellor. And Anakin actually features prominently into this. However, unlike what we saw with Palpatine's sort of preconceived version of the virgin birth, Palpatine is not actually previously aware of what Anakin is. But Palpatine, of course, being a Sith, can feel his connection to the Force, as do the Jedi. And then he sees more opportunities that may stem from Palpatine himself being responsible for rescuing this Force-sensitive teenager. Now, as you can probably understand, Plagueis now has a major vendetta against Palpatine specifically, and has sent an intermediary ahead of the Neimoidian cruisers and pursuit ships, and the intermediary is there essentially to work and deal with the Hutts. And in the original draft, this was basically left ambiguous as to what the circumstances would be about them escaping from the planet. But what happens here is far more clear. The Hutts have been talking to the representatives of Plagueis and the Neimoidians, and the Hutts then decide to betray the Jedi, side with the Sith, and attack the Jedi as they're about to board the ship, having just sort of left Anakin's abode. Shmi convinces her son to leave her behind as she's been captured, and ultimately this all enables Anakin to escape with Obi-Wan, with Qui-Gon Jinn, and Palpatine, in the hope that the Jedi would offer him a better life, and also a means perhaps of rescuing his mother later. Palpatine, and just an image here, of course, in terms of the original pod race. When I talk about Hippodrome of Constantinople-esque, this is Charlton Heston in the original Ben-Hur. But needless to say, it would be a far sort of more dramatic and bloody affair than the original sort of pod race, even though many ships in that get destroyed. This will be, a 16-year-old, and also the entire pod race will be visible and in a far more sort of contained area, as opposed to the vast sort of planetary pod race we saw in the original film. Again, in terms of working these ideas, we don't get rid of the pod race, but rather we simply repurpose this and try to allow it to feed into the broader story. Because what does the pod race actually add to the broader story of all three films? It's just to establish that Anakin is a powerful, is a great pilot, and it also allows a convoluted series of events and a bet with Watto to allow the ship to be fixed, rather than something far less convoluted and simple, which is that Anakin is a incredibly powerful and gifted Force user, and like we actually saw with the Prepio in the original film, he is able to find a solution to fix the ship where no one else can. Now, Palpatine arrives at the Senate, and here he launches a stinging tirade against Valorum. Valorum, of course, Latin valor. That shouldn't be his name because it basically indicates an aspect of tragedy with the fall of Valorum, whereas in this redraft, the character of Valorum should be more unambiguously corrupt, not just what Palpatine refers to him as. Maybe you can take something, in terms of the Latin, like Pravus or Bacillus or something, in terms of being able to, let's just take Pravus as a name, Chancellor Pravus, even though it's quite close to Palpatine. But anyway, I hate the name Valorum because it's thematically inconsistent with everything that this draft represents. And here in the Senate, having returned, Palpatine, of course, has now gone through this ordeal with the Jedi. He has started off as the ambassador of the Republic in Coruscant, or rather the senator of the Republic in Naboo. He has gone to Tatooine. He has formed a relationship with the Jedi and Anakin, and it is off the back of that experience that he arrives in the Senate. And if anything, that adds to his gravitas and makes the whole need for him to dupe the Queen essentially into calling for the vote of no confidence, that becomes irrelevant, because Palpatine is basically, the attempts of my life have steeled my resolve, albeit it wouldn't be in the sense that he has now become a Dark Lord of the Sith, but rather he has grown through this experience. And indeed, as an audience, we see Palpatine's development, but again, it's very much an affected development because Palpatine's plan was already preconceived before the film had even begun. But anyway, in terms of a speech, let's say he says something like, "I stand before you, the Senate, as the speaker of a conquered planet against a broken system. I have seen and considered all of the failings of our system and this chancellorship. I have witnessed invasion, brazen violation of our laws, and mockery of our defenses. From the corruption of the Hutts to the warmongering of the Nemoidians, we stand here, all of us, powerless in the face of unrelenting aggression. No longer. Naboo demands the resignation of this chancellor to usher in a new and mighty era for our republic." And this image is Cicero and the Catiline conspiracy. And the Catiline conspiracy ostensibly was that Cicero was defending the republic against a nascent attempt to essentially form a sort of senatorial or military coup against the then established constitution. So in this situation, Palpatine is very much conceived of as the Cicero. He is the one reinforcing the institutions of the Republic. He is the one saving the Republic, in the sense also that he is the great orator. So it is ironic in a sense that Palpatine is simultaneously Cicero, Julius Caesar, Augustus, and indeed Adolf Hitler. All of these characters sort of combined into one, but I believe in many ways it makes the Senate scene far more compelling and electrifying rather than putting it all on the Queen. And indeed, Palpatine's desire to establish the sympathy vote, if anything, is compounded when the Queen is suffering back on the planet of Naboo, and he is there having gone through this experience. But it should be noted also, he has gone through a complete about turn, and this is entirely consistent with his character, who wants to essentially generate this situation in terms of allowing him to be in the best possible situation to take power. Why was he essentially whispering in the king's ear that, the Republic essentially will come to our aid to enable the planetary invasion? What does the planetary invasion enable Palpatine to do? To depose the Chancellor and become Chancellor himself. Now, I've actually been focused on this character on the left, which doesn't really have any development at all, other than the fact he's Valorum and later Palpatine's stand-in. Apparently, he is one Maz Ameda, and he is the chair or the president of the Senate. And I think a rather compelling moment where, if you were to have this great speech delivered against the Chancellor by Palpatine, is that the president of the Senate, Maz Ameda, actually stands up, and rather than shouting order, he applauds Palpatine. And this would only add, you can say, to the mortification of the Chancellor, that he's been so completely and utterly outmaneuvered that even his erstwhile ally and the president of the Senate is actually wanting to bring in the new era of Palpatine. Valorum then resigns, and it is this character, Maz Ameda, in the redraft of the second redraft, he is named Chancellor Pro Tem until a formal election can take place and Palpatine then becomes Chancellor. Then we come back to the Jedi Council, and it is actually Maza Mader himself who comes to the Jedi Council to weigh in on the Naboo debate. Of course, having established already the principles of the philosophical disputations between the various factions of Jedi. When Maza Mader arrives, this is essentially allusion to when Anakin sits on the Jedi Council in the third film, Revenge of the Sith. He does so not as a Jedi Master or even a respected member of the Jedi, but as the representative of the Chancellor. Now, in this conception, you can say, of the Jedi Council are obviously a political force, and indeed, as a military force and as a diplomatic force, you can say that they are indispensable to the Republic. So there is obviously a political aspect to them. There is obviously a major political aspect to them. However, because of the corruption of the Republican institutions, and because of the, you can say, the supremacism of the Jedi, their isolationism, them turning a blind eye to all the corruption which has become rampant throughout the Republic, these institutions are actually seldom acting in tandem. They seldom ever mesh because there isn't a clear vision for what the Republic is. However, there is a right for the Chancellor to actually appear and assume a seat on the Council. And here, Maza Mader actually comes to the Jedi Council and demands that he be able to sit on the Council. Ki-Adi-Mundi is obviously the conservative leader, and he's the one most concerned with the defense of the Jedi's prerogatives, and he wants to bar this political figure from entering into the Jedi Council's debates, and he cites a violation of precedent, that the president of the Senate is far too close to his ally, Palpatine, and that Palpatine can't wait to meddle in the affairs of the Jedi even before his formal election. Or you can say Ki-Adi-Mundi actually berates Palpatine and calls it a formal coronation. And from a political point of view, you can say this actually establishes a huge amount of character for Ki-Adi-Mundi, that he's already defending the prerogatives of the Jedi against that of the political leadership. And indeed, if you watch the stream with me and Nathan Hood, the culmination of Ki-Adi-Mundi's arc essentially is that Ki-Adi-Mundi is the one that wants to leave Palpatine to his fate as the captive of Count Dooku. So this would actually establish that original enmity that is going to carry on through the first three films, this original presentation of Maza Mader as the representative of Palpatine on the Council. However, Qui-Gon Jinn is the one to rebuff Ki-Adi-Mundi and says that even if Palpatine was simply there to meddle in the affairs of the Jedi, Palpatine had that experience, the experience that he had shared with Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan. And then we come back to the original debates over the interventionist faction and the conservative faction about what to do with the Naboo situation. And it very much plays out how we see in the original redraft. However, you can almost emphasize that when Dooku concedes that he cannot go with the Jedi to lead that force, to go alongside them, he almost sort of breaks down in tears. The experience almost breaks him in the sense that he can't form a formal schism in the Jedi triumvirate, but at the same time, he is completely in sympathy with those Jedi who want to go and confront Plagueis and the Neimoidians in Naboo. And indeed, that position is spurred on by Maza Mader, representing Palpatine, emphasizing the interventionist faction. And so all of these things are playing into the original Jedi Council debates. And as you can say, a compromise, the Council issues a meager 5 Jedi, including Mace Windu. Mace Windu isn't a Jedi Master in this draft, but rather he's a powerful Jedi Knight. And you can say this actually lends into the strengths of Samuel Jackson as an actor, in the sense that he's essentially, he's good at fighting people effectively. He's good at becoming incredibly angry and just wailing at people. And indeed desperately trying to hold in that anger, which isn't at all apparent when he's actually a character who basically engages in no action throughout the first film and most of the second film until the third film. And just also as a visual reference before I move on, which is obviously this is Vatican II. Just to sort of, if I'm going to bring in a Catholic analogy to the debates which are fracturing the Jedi Council between the quote unquote more sort of conservative trad elements and the more sort of progressive, sort of secularist, sort of sympathizing elements of this council, and of course the schism that occurs, of course, with organizations like the SSPX after this, and division between Latin Mass Catholics and Novus Ordo Catholics. But just sort of moving on, I thought that was a rather sort of apt analogy in some ways, but perhaps contrived in others. There's also something I also want to bring in regarding the, you can say, the deviation or the decline of the Jedi Council. And this is actually something that Mazameda brings up almost to attack Ki-Adi-Mundi, which is that the Jedi had become a political force. And as a result, they had become less focused on the Force. The emphasis here is that the original Jedi Council was based on the Temple of Dantooine, which is far removed from the affairs of the Republic. And yet they are based now on Coruscant, at the heart of power. They are the diplomatic force. They are basically the Knights of the Republic, the Knights of the Old Republic. And in that capacity, they have become corrupted by the Republic itself, rather than standing apart from it as its own separate force. And so you can say Ki-Adi-Mundi is not just emphasizing the philosophical points of the defense of the Jedi, but also the political prerogatives of the Jedi. You can almost say that the Jedi, as they do very much in terms of the actual prequels in the third film, they look down on the office of the Chancellor. They consider that the secular functionaries of the Republic are beneath them, and that they essentially can call the final shots in terms of war and even sort of domestic policy making decisions. And this point about the sort of naturalists and the urbanists, I think, is actually between Dantooine and Coruscant, is actually something that can perhaps allude to what we see with Yoda on Dagobah, and the idea of Vader referencing this technological terror you have constructed, the idea of technology, cold, sterile technology, versus sort of a sort of harmonious aspect with nature. All of these things can actually be brought up in terms of the corruption of the Jedi as being represented within Coruscant itself. But nevertheless, moving on with the idea that the Council has established a token force to deal with the Naboo situation, partly as a result of the political prompting of Palpatine through his intermediary Mazameda, we come to Anakin. Anakin is tested for his Force abilities, and prominently he's able to demonstrate great telekinetic powers and telepathic powers, i.e. the ability to move rocks, but also the ability to communicate ideas between minds without speaking, and reveal other people's thoughts. From his background here, all the Jedi Council, save Dooku, believe that he cannot be trained as a warrior, as the Sith have made their presence known. This is actually quite similar to the first draft, where the idea is that there was universal training suggestion, but it's about what that training means. I think in terms of the audience actually having a clear understanding of that, I think the idea that he's going to be trained, but training is ambiguous, isn't exactly very clear to the audience. So what is actually emphasized here by Ki-Adi-Mundi is that to go on a retreat and to repress will, to repress anything that can tempt Anakin to the dark side, is not training. Rather, it is emphasized clearly as virtual imprisonment. And it is here where Obi-Wan defies the Council and rescues the young Anakin by helping him stow away on the Jedi cruiser. And this generates a disturbance in the Force on the ship, something which Qui-Gon alludes to. So very clearly here, the majority of the Council, save for Dooku, essentially want to nullify Anakin. He cannot be let out of their sight. He cannot be trained as a Jedi. He essentially has to retreat away from any sort of political intrigues or battles, and he essentially has to repress everything about himself, every aspect, which essentially makes him autonomous, a mental slavery as well as a physical slavery, as we saw with the Hutts. And of course, Obi-Wan, who was responsible more than anyone else to rescue this character, cannot stand by and do nothing, while Ki-Adi-Mundi and the Jedi Council has sentenced Anakin to this state of permanent imprisonment. And so he feels a complete sort of compulsion to help Anakin by allowing him to have some sort of positive effect by joining him, being responsible for caring for him and taking him on this trip to Naboo, where essentially he can perhaps even escape altogether. A lot of illusions you can bring here, but I think that's far more dramatic, that Obi-Wan is actually responsible for smuggling young Anakin away, rather than Anakin essentially having been allowed to leave as a commiseration by the Jedi, which was in the original draft. So in that way, it's far more dramatic, and the implications of him staying with the Jedi are that much more severe, and it pays off a little later. When in Naboo, it is finally discovered that Obi-Wan has stowed away Anakin, and Qui-Gon Jinn here threatens to expel Obi-Wan from the Jedi Order, very reminiscent of that scene in Attack of the Clones, where it is Obi-Wan threatening to expel Anakin from the Jedi Order over his relationship with Padme, albeit here you can say the implications are far more severe than the defense of Jedi celibacy. In terms of being able to conceive of the original defense of Naboo, the 5 Jedi split off. One Jedi, Mace Windu, is sent to organize the defense of Naboo against the Neimoidians, and here he enlists the help of Jar Jar as an intermediary. Again, emphasizing that fact that Jar Jar is that tragic figure raised by humans, banished by the Gungans. He represents all of Naboo in the sense that he represents the two opposing parts of it. And you can say, again, in terms of a cheap sort of trick, in terms of building sympathy towards Jar Jar as opposed to revilement, which his character calls an annoyance, is that you actually see him being scorned and berated by Palpatine. Because, of course, Jar Jar is the one who convinces Boss Nass to give them that crappy ship to go off to Tatooine. But nevertheless, Palpatine, informed by his hostility, essentially, as a Naboo citizen, is, and indeed he's not already a sympathetic character as a political advisor and a Sith. He treats Jar Jar like scum, and yet the culmination of Jar Jar's story arc is that he is the one able to bring the two forces on side, which are then enabled to defeat the droid army. And as I established earlier with the brief sort of talk on the aesthetics of the Jedi, sorry, just picture here Yoda, Mace Windu, and of course Ki-Adi-Mundi is the figure on the right, in case you're not familiar with who he is from the films. The emphasis here is that the droids would essentially be represented as the droidicas, as the battleships. They would be a terrifying, intimidating force, something which is far more sort of terrifying than the standard droids, which George Lucas himself sort of referred to as completely useless. So when there is that eucatastrophe, that it seems like Naboo has been defeated, and then kind of like the ride of the Rohirrim, the Gungans come over the hills and are able to rescue the hastily assembled Naboo militia under Mace Windu to actually deliver them victory, something which completely stupefies and surprises the droid armies, as they never expected these two figures to team up and form a united front. Again, I hate to bring in sort of more, it's like poetry, it rhymes, but you can almost say that this is the equivalent of, I would hope a more sort of compelling equivalent of having the Republic join forces with the Ewoks in Return of the Jedi. But anyway, going away from that, and looking at the situation with Pelagius, the other 4 Jedi, Padme has been captive. And earlier in the original redraft, I emphasized that the Neimoidians were after resources, the prospect of colonization and expansionism, and that both they and Darth Plagueis wanted to commit a attack on the Republic, which would basically expose all of its weaknesses by attacking a planet which was so dependent on the Republic and yet so wealthy, and thus essentially allow the Republic to disintegrate. But of course, Palpatine has gone off script. Palpatine has betrayed Plagueis, his master, and Palpatine has used this as a political opportunity to allow him to rise to become Supreme Chancellor of the Republic. And now he is actually one of the principal antagonists to his master Plagueis, again, to really emphasize the core of the Phantom Menace, which I hope is actually quite far more satisfying in that sense, that there is that original animosity as well as the competing philosophies. But as you may recall, the fight between Maul and Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon takes place in this massive power station. And this actually sort of inspired me in terms of being able to really flesh out why the Neimoidians are here. Is that this power station, you could almost say it's like a super fusion reactor. And it is unlike anything else in the galaxy in the sense that this is actually something with enough power that can generate the production of clone armies on an unprecedented scale. And indeed, in terms of feeding into the whole Attack on the Republic plot, the Naboo power station can actually not just fuel the sort of very affluent society of Naboo, but it's also there as essentially something upon which all neighboring planetary systems are dependent. So take out Naboo, and all of a sudden, all of the other planets are also defenseless, and the Republic has lost a major sort of economic power source in the Naboo power station. So taking that inspiration from the films, I think that is actually a quite clear motivation as to why Naboo, among all of these other things, would be such a tempting target. And of course, that actually adds context to why they're fighting in that incredible setting, because that is why, in many senses, the Neimoidians are there. That will be the engine of their new army. It is here that the four Jedi are lured into a trap by Darth Plagueis. The Jedi sense his presence through the Force, and Obi-Wan tells Anakin to run. However, Anakin doesn't run. He hides and watches what is about to ensue. As we saw actually in the film, I think the power station can act as a very compelling venue for the attack. One of my ideas is that the station can essentially, with its many sort of components to it, many sort of corridors and detachments, is that it can essentially act as a pseudo wall of mirrors. And one of Pelagius's force abilities is that he's able to project images of himself, kind of like holograms, to disorient the Jedi by appearing behind all of these sort of contained aspects of the power station. However, the caveat to this is that he can't use other force powers at the same time. He's not strong enough in the force, despite the fact he's far stronger than any of the Jedi there, all of them combined. And here, Pelagius is able to actually taunt the Jedi that he has turned off all the power station safety systems, and that any reckless attempt by the Jedi to engage Plagueis in combat may lead to all of their deaths and the deaths of all the citizens of Naboo. And that would actually create massive stakes for all of the Jedi there, because even if the Jedi are desperate to kill Plagueis, they won't kill Plagueis at the risk of essentially detonating the power station and destroying essentially the Naboo economy and causing a massive explosion on Naboo itself. And you can almost say this turns into a horror scene. All of these Jedi are seeing force projections of Plagueis appearing in one section of the power station and another, and then all of a sudden one of the Jedi turns around and they are killed by Plagueis, and then another, until you're finally left with Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon Jinn. Of course, in the original film, Anakin, by accident, flies a Naboo fighter jet and takes down accidentally the Neimoidian droid command ship, which I think everyone agrees is incredibly silly and stupid. And therefore, I had to find a way in which Anakin can be relevant in the end, in the third act of this film. Something which Nathan and I weren't really able to come to grips with because that idea wasn't developed enough in the original redraft. In terms of my development of this, Anakin already established in his conference with the Jedi Council that he has telekinetic and telepathic abilities. And so he is able to communicate through the Force. And also, as is set up early in the film, Anakin is a master mechanic. And so he is able to discover that the power stations essentially can be turned on, the safety systems can be turned on. But an aspect of the safety systems is that there is a fire control system whereby if any sort of one reactor in the power plant explodes, the segment is quarantined and the explosion essentially is nullified. And Anakin is able to tell Obi-Wan this, kind of like what we see, or exactly like what we see in A New Hope, where Obi-Wan is communicating with Luke, telling him to run, and then telling him to use the Force when attacking the Death Star. Anakin here discovers this ability, and indeed the fact that Anakin is using this ability on Obi-Wan, I think is actually quite a nice nod to when Obi-Wan uses it with Luke. But anyway, in essence, it's the exact same ability. Anakin finds he's able to do this based on what has been previously established, and Obi-Wan is now essentially trying to hold off Plagueis until Anakin is able to fix the safety systems within the power station. Operating the system would allow for the Jedi to trap Plagueis potentially indefinitely, because of course those quarantine zones within the power station. However, Plagueis is able to listen in on Anakin's conversation because of course he is also a telepath. He is also able to sense Anakin's presence in the Force, like Palpatine, like the Jedi. He's able to locate Anakin, and he uses his, you can say, Force lightning to electrocute Anakin, thus knocking Anakin out for the duration of the flight. Although Anakin has lasted long enough where he's been able to turn on the fire control systems, but he hasn't been able to use it to quarantine Plagueis yet. So with the system activated, Qui-Gon now understands that the only way to actually trap Plagueis, if the system is active, is to trigger it. And so he destroys one of the reactors, killing both him and Plagueis, and then enabling the quarantine essentially to operate around them. And all Obi-Wan can do is look horrified as both Plagueis and Qui-Gon are disintegrated in front of him. But nevertheless, Anakin recovers, he regains consciousness, and Plagueis is defeated. And this is very much Nathan's idea that the Jedi themselves, unlike with Maul, aren't powerful enough, and Obi-Wan alone is definitely not powerful enough to defeat Darth Plagueis, who may in fact be the most powerful Force combatant in all of these three films, if we're going to look at this redraft. And so having him die in this sort of very dramatic way in which he is essentially destroyed by a power reactor, you can say is far more compelling than him being killed off in a straight lightsaber duel or a confrontation of Force powers. And this is actually something else which one can bring in here, which is that, of course, Padme has been secluded somewhere in the power station. She is finally found, and she is found in a stasis room deep in the reactor complex. And her mere presence close to Plagueis was enough to actually corrupt her. And as a result, she's actually close to death. This demonstrates to Anakin the pervasive nature of the dark side and shows Padme close to death. And these are important factors that will color Anakin's relationship with both Palpatine and generate a paranoia regarding Padme. What do I mean in terms of important factors regarding coloring his relationship with Palpatine? Well, Plagueis had so much dark side Force energy that it actually had an effect on all of those around him and nearly killed Padme, thus adding real stakes to the time concern of them coming back and rescuing her, albeit they're not entirely aware of that. Palpatine is the opposite of that. Palpatine's whole sort of Force ability, the greatest Force ability really he demonstrates throughout all of these films, is that none of the Jedi can recognize him as a Force user. He suppresses the Force. And it is the experience of Plagueis that actually blinds not Anakin but all of the Jedi to the danger of Palpatine, because Palpatine is a very powerful dark side force user, yet he is using all of his passive force ability to prevent essentially any suggestion that not only is he a dark side force user, but he has any connection to the force whatsoever. And it's this one factor, I think, which keeps Anakin on side and so dedicated to Palpatine and disbelieving that Palpatine is a dark side force user right up until the end of the third film. So I think this is very important in terms of the character development of all of these things. Anakin now has something tangible going forward to construct, you can say, these character arcs around. Now we come back to Obi-Wan and the mention that Qui-Gon had basically threatened Obi-Wan with excommunication from the Jedi Order because of what he'd done with Anakin and deliberately defying the Order. Mace has returned from leading the Naboo and Gungan forces in their successful gambit essentially to capture the Viceroy and ransom him back to the Neimoidians and force them to retreat. And it's here that Mace and Yoda, who has returned upon the defeat of Darth Plagueis, he has visited Naboo. Mace and Yoda concede that Anakin has seen too much. Anakin has experienced a battle. He may long for battle, though Plagueis is now dead. And so the threat of his temptation to the dark side has depleted considerably. Therefore, as penance, Obi-Wan must vouch for Anakin's good training under the threat of expulsion and under close surveillance by the Jedi. So having originally pronounced against Anakin that he must essentially become a Force hermit, the experience of Anakin on Naboo, as complete contrast to what we saw with the Jake Lloyd iteration in the original prequels, is actually strong enough to convince the Jedi very reluctantly that they have no choice but to train Anakin to effectively be a Jedi, that this can be a punishment for Obi-Wan, but moreover, this makes logical sense where it didn't before, because Plagueis is now dead, and they believe that the major threat of the Sith in the world is now gone, completely oblivious to the Phantom Menace, who is, of course, Palpatine. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this. I hope you enjoyed it, and it has been suggested that this may form the basis of a multimedia project if more streams, more sort of ideas can be developed, perhaps more dialogue, sort of artistic projects, all that sort of thing. But it is possible I may return to do one of these Perfecting the Prequel streams with Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. Thank you everyone else for watching.